Sing to me.
Always
Beautiful day, isn't it? That means we should all be smiling. You did. I've asked Brother Dan Gilbert if he would to lead us in a prayer before we get started. Brother Dan, there's a mic there.
Thank you. Our Father, we thank you that we can be here together today to express our mutual love and appreciation to you for what you do for us. We thank you for every blessing that you give us. Please help us to be as generous with other people as you are with us. Be with those who are sick, those who are sad, those who have lost their loved ones just recently. Comfort them and strengthen them as only you can. Be with us as we study together today, and be with Brother Brown as he leads our thinking. Help him to teach us more about you and Christ and the Holy Spirit and the church. Be with those who couldn't be with us today, and bless them and help them to get well. In Jesus' name, amen.
I want to thank Mark for asking me to fill in for Jeff this morning. When you study just 1 week, it's really difficult, if you're a teacher, you know this, to try to come up with a topic that will be beneficial. This morning, I really wanted to just go back to something that probably all of us are very familiar with, but it never hurts for us to be reminded, where did the children of Israel come from? How did they grow? Why did they become God's children? Those kind of things. So I just titled the lesson, How Did We Get to Egypt? And we'll carry through from that and talk a little bit about Moses as well and his leadership. First of all, I think it's really important to realize that about one third of the Old Testament is about the character of Moses. He was very prominent, so we're going to talk a little bit about him. From Abraham to Jacob, let's go back in our memory now. We know that Abraham was Abram at the time from the Ur Chaldees, and he was told to leave, and he didn't say why, where, what. He just left. We know that he left with his wife and with Lot. Abraham was married to Sarah, and Abraham had a house servant named Hagar. If you remember, Abraham said, he and Sarah said, there's no way we're going to have children. We're too old. It's not going to happen. And by miraculous means, they had a child. His name was Isaac. Abraham and Hagar, prior to that, had Ishmael because Abraham questioned as to whether he would ever be able to have a child or not. Then Isaac married Rebekah. They had Jacob and Esau. And then Jacob and Leah had 6 children, Jacob and Zilpah 2, Bilhah 2, and Rachel 2. Those are the 12 sons right there. That's where it all starts, with just those 12 men. Started with Abraham, his seed, and now we have Reuben, Simeon, Levi, Judah, Issachar, Zebulun, Gad, Asher, Dan, Naphtali, Joseph, and Benjamin. We know that Joseph's brothers became very jealous. He went out into the field to carry them some food, and they became very jealous, and they decided that they would just throw him into a pit, either murder him or sell him into slavery. And the decision was made was to sell him into slavery. And this is where it really begins, God's providence. It's amazing how God works in our lives. Because who would have ever dreamed that Joseph, being arrested, would be sent to a man by the name of Potiphar's house and became so powerful that he became second in command. He withstood temptation. He went to prison. He became a dream teller, and that's how he became famous. And he became powerful. He became as powerful as the governor. Now, why is that important? Well, because there was a great famine going on. And Joseph's brothers who had sold him into slavery, their father said, we got to have food. We need to go into Egypt, and that's where Joseph was, of course. We got to try to get some food because we're going to starve if we don't. So some of the brothers were sent. If you remember, Benjamin was stayed back with his father. And the men went and they were able to appear before Joseph. Did not know who he was. And then he revealed himself to his brothers. And at that point, his entire family then goes to Egypt. And that's where we start. And please, if you have any comments, please raise your hand. Now we see a growth of the nation.
We got about 70 people at that time now.
Yes, sir. Yeah. Thank you, Jim. Right down here. While he's getting the mic, I'm going to keep going here real quick. I have a lot to cover. Pharaoh was concerned about the power that they had in numbers, and therefore he made it very hard and very difficult for them and made them start making bricks. Yes, ma'am.
We have to remember also there was a famine in the land, and Jacob took his family. Joseph took care of them. They were given wonderful land in Egypt, and it was all in God's plan.
Yeah. There's so much information that I won't be able to cover, but that's a very valid point. As I said, there was a famine. That's why they went to Egypt, because they were hungry. And then a lot of things transpired during that time. At that time, was Pharaoh good to Joseph and his brothers? Very good. Very good, absolutely. We're going to see a change of reign here in a little while and see how that does change. So let's go ahead and turn to Exodus chapter 1, Greg. I've asked Greg if you would to read. Let's go ahead and read verses 1 through 6 and get some context here.
Now these are the names of the sons of Israel who came to Egypt with Jacob. They came each one with his household: Reuben, Simeon, Levi, and Judah, Issachar, Zebulun, and Benjamin, Dan and Naphtali, Gad and Asher. All the persons who came from the loins of Jacob were 70 in number, but Joseph was already in Egypt. Joseph died, and all his brothers and all that generation.
These 6 verses basically are bridging Genesis to the book of Exodus. It's exactly what we see here. Go ahead and read verse 7, Greg, please.
But the sons of Israel were fruitful and increased greatly and multiplied and became exceedingly mighty, so that the land was filled with them.
There's some words that are used here in this verse, I think, that shows again that God had his hand on this. Some of those words were, they were fruitful. They increased, what's the word? Abundantly. They multiplied. They waxed exceeding mighty. Consider this, as Jim said, even supposing the 70 with their households would have numbered no more than 500 persons when they went down to Egypt, the people would have just with an average increase have numbered more than 2 million at the expiration of the time that they were there in Egypt. That's to say 130 years before the Exodus from Egypt. But we here see that supernatural growth by seeing terms that we just mentioned that are used in verse 7. Verses 8 through 14, Greg.
Now a new king arose over Egypt, who did not know Joseph. He said to his people, "Behold, the people of the sons of Israel are more and mightier than we. Come, let us deal wisely with them, or else they will multiply, and in the event of war, they will also join themselves to those who hate us, and fight against us, and depart from the land." So they appointed taskmasters over them to afflict them with hard labor, and they built for Pharaoh storage cities, Pithom and Ramses. But the more they afflicted them, the more they multiplied, and the more they spread out, so that they were in dread of the sons of Israel. The Egyptians compelled the sons of Israel to labor vigorously, and they made their lives bitter with hard labor in mortar and bricks, and at all kinds of labor in the field, all their labors which they vigorously imposed on them.
So the description here is there is a new king. Is that good or bad for the children of Israel? Doesn't look to be very good at all, does it? The change of power, what we see now is not only the labor, but more intensive labor. They've been reduced to a people of slavery, and the agreement that was originally obviously had between Joseph and his family and those people, and all the people, was not the case anymore. And this king obviously was just a tyrant. From a human standpoint, it would appear that Israel would be doomed and hopeless and be that way forever. In verse 9, it says, the children are more and mightier. Egypt at that time was assumed to have between probably 2 and 3 million citizens. That's what historians say. Numbers chapter 2, verse 32 tells us this. Okay, I missed that slide, excuse me. Numbers chapter 2, verse 32 informs us that Israel had over 600,000 fighting men, which again confirms a plausible fact. The Israelites numbered over 2 million people at that time. Now, if you were a nation and you enslaved people, and there were about as many people of enemies or slaves as there were you as citizens, how would you feel? Common sense tells us there was some concern there, wasn't there? Especially on this tyrant Pharaoh. Pharaoh probably, don't think he feared maybe an uprising of those people because they were so tied down. They had their thumbs on them. What he probably did fear, though, is an invader who might politicize with the children of Israel and help them out of their plight. By this time, the Israelites certainly hated the Egyptians and would welcome any force from the outside that would be able to help them. It's really hard to understand the harshness of the work that's demanded on them. All of us probably in our younger years, or maybe even now, experience really hard work at some point in our lives. And yet, to understand how much they went through was phenomenal. There are recorded paintings done in the 15th century in the tomb of Rekhmire at Thebes. And what it does, it shows the enslavement of the Israelites. The pictures show backbreaking work in the field and in construction. They only had loincloths to wear, and they said the temperature there would be just almost unbearable, up to 130 degrees temperature. And these are some of the cave drawings that you can find. Hebrews making mud bricks is the one this one exemplifies. And you can see once again, they don't wear much at all. They're not given much at all to work with at this point. And as you well know, it even becomes more difficult because of the straw that they were having to collect. Any comments? I'm moving along pretty quick. Verses 15 through 18.
Then the king of Egypt spoke to the Hebrew midwives, one of whom was Shiphrah, and the other was Puah. And he said, when you are helping the Hebrew women to give birth and see them upon the birth stool, if it is a son, then you shall put him to death. But if it is a daughter, then she shall live. But the midwives feared God and did not do as the king of Egypt had commanded them, but let the boys live. So the king of Egypt called on the midwives and said to them, why have you done this thing and let the boys live?
This is really interesting. It's known for a fact that at that time, it appears that Egyptian women were not as big in size as the Israelites women. We see that in history, a lot of times in depictions. This diabolical commandment, however, of Pharaoh, it reveals his evil, his savage notions. And now we've stepped it up, haven't we? We've gone from slavery and very difficult, hard work to the fear is so overwhelming that we're going to stop the population. If you have a child that's born, then that child will be killed at birth. A birth stool simply is a form of chair that women used in labor and they sat on during the act of giving birth. What we find interesting is in the verses 19 through 22, how these two women, Shiphrah and Puah, who were the heads of the midwives, used their profession to help save these babies. So let's read verses 19 through 22.
The midwives said to Pharaoh, because the Hebrew women are not as the Egyptian women, for they are vigorous and give birth before the midwives can get to them. So God was good to the midwives, and the people multiplied and became very mighty. Because the midwives feared God, he established households for them. Then Pharaoh commanded all his people, saying, Every son who is born you are to cast into the Nile, and every daughter you are to keep alive.
So what are the midwives saying here? Saying these Hebrew women, they don't need midwives. We don't know that babies are being born, so don't hold us accountable if we don't know that babies are being born. It appears that they did full well know probably what was going on, but they used their position to protect these babies. The midwives found it necessary to try to deceive Pharaoh to protect themselves with this explanation that they were larger women and they could give birth without a lot of pain. It's also interesting to note that Egyptian women were different. Pictures that are excavated from ancient tombs show that Egyptian women were more delicate and they were smaller in stature than Hebrew women, which makes sense to everything we just talked about. So, a note of interest is after the attempt with the midwives failed, which means that they would go and instead of they would give birth to the child and make sure the baby was killed. All his people had to follow the order of killing boys and save the girls. Verse 21, Greg.
21. Because the midwives feared God, he established households for them.
Go ahead, 22. I'm sorry, do the end of the chapter.
Then Pharaoh commanded all his people, saying, Every son who is born you are to cast into the Nile, and every daughter you are to keep alive.
So we find in verse 21 that the midwives are rewarded. It says that God blessed the midwives with marriage and many descendants. And actually that's the same phrase that's used with reference to David's house later on in the Word of God. Anything before we get into Moses? So now we know, as a reminder, how we got to Egypt, how the children of Israel have grown, how they're now being treated just horribly to the point now where babies are being killed at birth because of the fear of this nation. So God's people are certainly being tormented at this point. There's 232, headed out of order. These are they that are numbered of the children of Israel by their fathers' houses, all that were numbered of the camps according to their host, 600,000 and 3,560. Here's what Josephus says. He says, he tells us how Pharaoh had been forewarned by one of his magi that a Hebrew boy about to be born would inflict a fatal blow on Egypt and raise his own race to liberty and independence. That's another reason, if this Pharaoh, of course, believed the Magi's, another reason why he would want to kill all the male children, because he didn't know which one of those children might be the one that has been predicted that would grow up and raise havoc on Egypt. Yes.
Just keep in mind, this is the same scenario at the time of Christ, too, when Herod was trying to make sure he killed Christ.
Good point. Absolutely. Verses 1 and 2 of chapter 2, Greg.
Now a man from the house of Levi went and married a daughter of Levi. The woman conceived and bore a son, and when she saw that he was beautiful, she hid him for 3 months.
It's kind of interesting. The account of Moses' birth is related kind of casually and matter-of-factly at this point. It becomes easy to overlook the overruling providence of God that controls every little detail that we're getting ready to read about. We've already seen God's providence in so many things. We also find that Moses' parents' names are revealed over in chapter 6. They are Amram, and Jochebed. There were 2 older children. Miriam already was about 15 years old, and Aaron, who was about 3 years older than Moses. He's called him a goodly child. Appears to be based on the beauty of the child that Moses possessed. And that many times, as we know, when you see a really beautiful baby, it just seems to appear that more grace is shown from a woman's heart to that baby than maybe other babies. I think that's just human nature. But anyway, when Pharaoh's daughter saw him, she saw him as a goodly child. Verses 3 and 4.
But when she could hide him no longer, she got him a wicker basket and covered it over with tar and pitch. Then she put the child into it and set it upon the reeds by the bank of the Nile. His sister stood at a distance to find out what would happen to him.
Bulrush. It's a chest. Excuse me, I've got a cold. I'm eating a lifesaver here. Excuse me. It's a chest that's made of the stalks of the papyrus reed, which still grows profusely along the banks of the Nile. It was used widely for the use of baskets, boats, mats, ropes, sails, and paper. And that's what Moses was found in by the daughter and her attendants. And that's the papyrus reed that actually grows from which the bulrush would have been made. Verses 5 and 6, please.
The daughter of Pharaoh came down to bathe at the Nile, with her maidens walking alongside the Nile. And she saw the basket among the reeds, and sent her maid, and she brought it to her. When she opened it, she saw the child, and behold, the boy was crying. And she had pity on him, and said, "This is one of the Hebrews' children."
There are ancient monuments and depictions given of the scenes of Pharaoh's daughter when she goes down to the Nile and finds Moses. What's interesting, it looks like every account shows 4 handmaidens in attendance, and they're there, of course, to give aid to her. She was going to bathe in the Nile, and they were there to take care of every need that she might have. What do we know about the Nile? It has crocodiles and gators, right? It was worshipped, right? And bathing in its waters was supposed to enrich, protect, and heal those people that bathed in it. It would appear that Jochebed knew not only where the princess would bathe, but when. Who was Jochebed? Who was Jochebed? Moses' mother. It says, and behold, the child wept. Several of us in here are grandparents. When our grandchild cries, what do? You better believe we make a mad dash to comfort that child. Are there any grandparents here that don't want to pick up the grandchild when they're crying? The answer to that is no. Or if you're a young parent and have children, you know the same thing. So compassion overflowed from Pharaoh's daughter to Moses. Now here's a very interesting fact that I found. How the killing could be going on with this is interesting. Egyptians regarded tenderness to an infant as a condition of acceptance of the day of reckoning. There was a line in their funeral ritual which claimed on behalf of the dead that I have not withheld milk from the mouths of sucklings. So even though the Egyptians regarded infants in that like this, Pharaoh was still commanding babies be killed. Verses 7 through 9, please.
Then his sister said to Pharaoh's daughter, "Shall I go and call a nurse for you from the Hebrew women, that she may nurse the child for you?" Pharaoh's daughter said to her, "Go ahead." So the girl went and called the child's mother. Then Pharaoh's daughter said to her, "Take this child away and nurse him for me, and I will give you your wages." So the woman took the child and nursed him.
Okay, now let's wait a minute. Let's think about this for a minute. How emotional would it have been for that woman who was the mother of that child, who had to hide it to keep it from being killed? Ladies, put yourself in her position. You're now given the opportunity to breastfeed your child that you thought you would possibly never see again. And yet again, God's providence comes into play. I think so many times we read the Bible, we being me, and we overlook the fact that these are human beings. These are people that have emotions and feelings. They cried, they laughed. This woman had to have been overwhelmed with joy, knowing that she had this opportunity. And guess what? Normally during that time, women didn't wean their children until they were about 3 years old. So she knew that. She already had 2 older children. So that meant that with a little bit of help from God, she'd be able to teach this child and be around this child for probably close to 3 years. I think that's a very interesting fact. The
David?
location of the landing didn't just happen by accident.
David,
Yeah.
I was going to say, I think she must have had an influence on that child more than 3 years, because later on, when he has the choice, I'm getting ahead of it, I'm sure, he preferred to be put under the situation where he was an Israelite instead of be raised like he was raised as the Pharaoh's grandson, if you will, or son.
Right.
And he chose to take on that persecution as opposed to being raised as a king, if you will.
Good point. Good point. So it wasn't an accident. God landed Moses at the palace. Instead of death, he was endowed with royalty. He became heir to the throne. He had the best education available in the world at the time. He was nursed by his own mother. And here we find in Acts chapter 7, verse 22. And Moses was instructed in all the wisdom of the Egyptians, and he was mighty in his words and his works. So we know that he had the best of education. He had the best of probably dwelling facilities to live in. He had power. He had everything that we as men and women would probably want from a worldly standpoint. Verse 10 by itself, please, Greg.
The child grew, and she brought him to Pharaoh's daughter, and he became her son. And she named him Moses and said, because I drew him out of the water.
Now, if you look at the word Moses, Mo means water, and Usis means rescued from the water, so a very obviously appropriate name. In Hebrew, it means brought forth, so it had similar meanings as well. Let's go on to verses 11 through 15, Greg, please.
Now it came about in those days, when Moses had grown up, that he went out to his brethren and looked on their hard labors. And he saw an Egyptian beating a Hebrew, one of his brethren. So he looked this way and that, and when he saw there was no one around, he struck down the Egyptian and hid him in the sand. He went out the next day, and behold, 2 Hebrews were fighting with each other. And he said to the offender, why are you striking your companion? But he said, who made you a prince or a judge over us? Are you intending to kill me as you killed the Egyptian? Then Moses was afraid and said, surely the matter has become known. When Pharaoh heard of this matter, he tried to kill Moses, but Moses fled from the presence of Pharaoh and settled in the land of Midian, and he sat down by a well.
So now what do you think about Moses? Anybody? What do you think about Moses now? He doesn't look like a leader. What else? He was a man who reacted. He probably had a temper, didn't he? What else? I'm sorry? Okay, he aligned himself with his people, the Israelites. Brad?
Interesting how God used certain
Okay, good point. Was he punished because of this murder that he committed?
He lost his apprenticeship, so he was a refugee at this time.
Okay. I don't know if y'all could hear the comments or not. Repeat louder. Yes, ma'am. He would have been punished. I'm talking about, was he punished by God for murdering this person? Brad hit on it right a little while ago. We all sin, we all make mistakes, and if we decide to turn our lives a different direction, then those things in our past can be forgotten. Billy Taylor hit on something I thought was very important. He was a human being just like we are. So the fact is, however, he certainly didn't feel comfortable with his plush surroundings, as Jim had mentioned. He had compassion for his other Hebrew brethren. And even though he had compassion for his Hebrew brethren, what did they do to him? They turned on him. How many times do we see them do that to Moses as he's leading the people through the wilderness? What a man. He has become, by the time we see him in the wilderness wanderings toward the end of his life, it's amazing the manner of character that he was. It truly is. Of course, Moses killing.
It is said later on, he was the most humble man that ever lived.
Yep. Moses' killing of the Egyptian put him at direct odds with Pharaoh. In a sense, what he had done is he rebelled against Pharaoh. He rebelled against the lifestyle that he had been given and the culture that he had. And we don't know for certain if it was the same Pharaoh that allowed him to, his daughter to keep him or not. History doesn't tell us. But what we do know is this act caused him to lose all power and all authority. What I find to be interesting too is that the transition is so fast. It seems odd to me that from one verse to the next, he's in Egypt and then he's on the run. We don't have any details about what happened, but we know that's what did happen. Verses 16 through 22, Greg.
Now the priest of Midian had 7 daughters, and they came to draw water and filled the troughs to water their father's flock. Then the shepherds came and drove them away, but Moses stood up and helped them and watered their flock. When they came to rule their father, he said, "Why have you come back so soon today?" So they said, "An Egyptian delivered us from the hand of the shepherds, and what is more, he even drew the water for us and watered the flock." He said to his daughters, "Where is he then? Why is it that you have left the man behind? Invite him to have something to eat." Moses was willing to dwell with the man, and he gave his daughter Zipporah to Moses. Then she gave birth to a son, and he named him Gershon, for he said, "I have been a sojourner in a foreign land."
So we see here again a glimpse of the type of man that he was. Now what do we see that happened where we see his bravery? What did he do? Shepherds wanted to try to run her off, didn't they? She was trying to get water, and evidently there were some shepherds there that refused, and Moses stood up and said this is not going to happen, ran the shepherds off, and not only gave them permission to have water, but also was able to take water for them. So I think that shows a little bit of more information. He was strong, courageous. He was considered, I think he'd be considered a tough type of fellow that would do that. Now here's what happens in a very short period of time. Moses receives Zipporah for his wife. He has a child. The child's name was Gershon, which means banishment. Moses' time in Midian is sometimes compared to the time of John the Baptist in the wilderness. It was a time for him to prepare. What was the age of Moses during that time, during this time? How old was he when he left Egypt?
40.
How old was he when he left being a servant when he saw the burning bush?
80.
And 3 different segments of 40-year spans is what we see of Moses' life. Yes, Miss Lori?
I'm sorry, did you already mention Acts chapter 7?
It did.
You did.
Yes, ma'am.
I think that when he starts here in Midian, he was not a humble man here when he left here. It took the 40 years in Midian to make him humble. I mean, to get him to where he became the humble man. Because the attitude he had here when he left Egypt was, this was going to happen because of him. I mean, he thought himself the leader, and it was going to take a lot of time to get him to the place where God needed him in his attitude, as far as humility.
Right. Okay, good point. Thank you. Anybody else? Verses 23 through 25. Oh, I'm sorry. While we're getting the mic, Tim, go ahead and read that, Greg. We'll get the mic to Win as soon as you get verses 23 through 25.
Now it came about in the course of those many days that the king of Egypt died, and the sons of Israel sighed because of the bondage, and they cried out, and their cry for help because of their bondage rose up to God. So God heard their groanings, and God remembered his covenant with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. God saw the sons of Israel, and God took notice of them.
Yes, Win.
Yeah. One thing to note is, what we've discussed about Moses so far is, there's really no indication that God has a plan for Moses at this point. No one, is, and that's sort of the thing, even when shortly when Moses goes back to Egypt, no one's, looking for, him. No one's looking for Moses to come along, and this is now, he's now, an old man basically, before God, uses him for, this purpose he has set out, all this time back with this covenant to Abraham.
Okay. Good point. Yes, ma'am.
I had never thought about it before, but it kind of hit me just a few minutes ago. Moses is given a job, taking care of a flock. That's not easy to do, and we don't know how large the flock was. And so he has spent about 40 years taking care of a flock. Don't you think that prepared him a little bit in taking care of a people? Because sheep don't always do what you want them to do, and neither do people.
Right. And I'll tell you something else it reminds me of is the fact that the first 40 years of his life was plush. He didn't have to do any work like that, I'm assuming. So, good point. Okay, verses 23 through 25, Greg just read. These really are just an introduction to chapter 3. We see from this text that God is determined to relieve the suffering of his people. This is the first time we kind of see God saying, I'm going to intervene here, and I'm going to interact with my people to save them. And when it says that he remembered them, he had never forgotten them. Comparing Moses to Christ, I found this to be kind of interesting. Maybe it's a good time as any to interject it. Both were the sons of virgin princesses, Jesus by miraculous birth, and Moses by adoption. They both left great joy and comfort to be identified with those in need. Boy, Jesus sure did that, didn't he? And so did Moses. Both were rejected, Jesus by his own nation and Moses by his own brethren. Anything we need to cover that we haven't covered up through chapter 2? We're not going to, anyway, we're going to make chapter 3. Okay.
You mentioned earlier about punishment. Was he punished? But to me, for him having to go to Midian, he had to leave everything he ever knew. So it could have been a form of punishment to go to a land that he knew no one. And he might not have been physically punished, but in a sense he was, because of the heartache he probably felt from leaving everyone he knew.
David?
Yes, Greg?
You know, so back when Moses was 40 and he sees the Egyptian beating the Hebrew, all right, he knows, you know, he was raised an Egyptian prince, but he knows he's a Hebrew by birth, by race. And, you know, he sees this Egyptian beating a Hebrew. It does not say, he looks, you know, around to see if anyone's looking, but that doesn't mean that Hebrew is not still there getting beat. And Moses may or may, you know, he may or may not have been, we don't know. But Moses reacts and killed the Egyptian, whether it was intentional or accidental, we don't know, and buries him. So it is not necessarily the case that Moses intentionally murdered him, number one. And number two, it could have, in fact, he could have intervened while it was happening and been self-defense. We don't know. So as far as punishment, I mean, we don't know what he did as far as a sin. And obviously, he does get punished. Pharaoh goes after him to try to kill him. And, you know, whether that was God's punishment, whatever, we don't know. But yes, it definitely changes Moses into a different man.
Very valid points. Yes, Sam?
Mine's kind of more of a question for those who might know better than I. Moses, Elijah, and Christ on the Mount of Transfiguration. To my knowledge, and that's why I'm asking, I believe those three men all fasted at some point for 40 days as well. I don't know of others that fasted for that time period. If anybody else knows, Wayne, if others fasted for that length of time. I know there was fasting that went on, obviously, periodically throughout the nation. But for that length of time, I don't know if those were the only men that fasted for that time frame or if there were others. So it's just a question.
Anybody? I guess that's a question for research. Good question. Okay. All right, let's see as far as we got about 2 minutes. Let's read verse 1, Greg, chapter 3.
Now Moses was pasturing the flock of Jethro in his father-in-law. Let me start over. Now Moses was pasturing the flock of Jethro, his father-in-law, the priest of Midian, and he led the flock to the west side of the wilderness and Mount Horeb, the mountain of God.
I think it's interesting that I've had a note, exactly kind of what Lori had mentioned earlier. I made a note here in verse 1. Since he had been a shepherd for almost 40 years, we now see his submissive and humble nature and also his loyalty. So that was a time frame, that 40 years, where he grew in different ways, all of which would be assets in his life in years to come. We didn't finish all of chapter 3. I hope what we talked about this day was a refresher of what you already probably knew. I appreciate your attention and comments. Thank you.